During the 18th century, a style of art and architecture began to gain popularity across Europe. Unlike the vivid colors of Baroque art, the style was more reserved, utilizing pastel shades instead. It was lighthearted and lavish and incorporated light heavily into its style. Its meanings often criticized the aristocrats of the old regime. The style was known as Rococo. The style originated in France. King Louis XIV built the city of Versailles, a wonder of the world, and it attracted aristocrats to live in it to be near him. After his death in 1715, the aristocrats had significantly less reason to reside in Versailles, so they relocated to Paris. And the mansions and estates and hotels that they ended up living in were pretty simple in their designs. The aristocrats couldn't do much about the exterior of these places, but they could spice up the interiors. So they used pastel colors to make the small rooms seem bigger, and other elements to make the style make their homes real lavish. The style also gained popularity from Louis XV, as he was a fan of it as well. Eventually, the style would become known as the style of Louis XVI. Another style that emerged during this time was centered around the return to forms of the Renaissance and the ancient world. It was known as neoclassical art. It was very popular in Rome, where the ancient world and Renaissance were both very prevalent. The style had its own unique qualities, such as that it rarely depicted motion within its subjects, but rather had stationary objects conveying moral themes. The style also began to use to be criticized politicians to promote new philosophical ideas. It started as a return to form, but quickly became its own beast entirely. Salons were very prevalent in France, and women were very prevalent in salons. These salons would foster philosophical discussions amongst these higher-class women in their attendance. The salons' management were very connected with those in power, and they used their connections to give the philosophers and their patronage a voice. This allowed women such as Marie-Thérèse, Geoffroy, Julie de Lespenis, and Claudie de Tencin to grow in fame. These salons also advocated for women's rights, such as in the areas of education and sexual relations. Women in society were often stereotyped as inferior to men, unable to comprehend serious business and work, frivolous with money and other important things in depth in many regards. The salons sought to push back against these false stereotypes. One book, the Encyclopedia, was meant to depict women as helpful and crucial members of society. Because of that, it was heavily censored. The fight against sexism allowed for many great female thinkers to rise to the cause as they eloquently condemned gender discrimination. One such woman was Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, where she condemned the mistreatment and subjugation of women. This allowed her to earn her place as not only one of the great female thinkers of the time, but one of the great thinkers of the time, without any regards to gender. Frederick the Great of Prussia embodied the philosophy of enlightened absolutism more than any other ruler of the Enlightenment. Frederick forged a state based on the loyalty of a strong military. Frederick's monarchy was incredibly centralized, and the nobles, clergy, bureaucracy, and university professors were all loyal to the monarchy. This allowed Frederick to encourage the open discussion of enlightenment ideas and values. Prussia allowed for the extensive religious tolerance that was much more than any other European state. Unlike any other European state, supporters of the Enlightenment tended to be loyal to the state rather than criticize it. Frederick held that any person who wished to enter into his esteemed bureaucracy would do so on their own merit. Frederick created the Prussian Civil Service Commission to oversee major government opponents. Frederick's philosophy of promotion based on merit allowed for Prussia to avoid the tensions between nobility and monarchy that troubled other European nations. Prussian professors were also unanimous in support of Frederick due to his personal support of teaching the Enlightenment. Since academic training was required for appointment to the positions of government, nobles had to attend universities where they would interact with the working class, which created a great environment for the spread of ideas. Frederick was a staunch supporter of religious tolerance. Frederick allowed for both Catholics and Jews to settle in Lutheran areas of the country. After conquering Silesia from the Habsburgs, he protected the Catholics in the area. Frederick even stated he'd be willing to build mosques for the Turks if they wished to enter Prussia. Frederick was also a champion of legal reform. He wished to rationalize the legal system to make it more fair and efficient by reducing the influence of the aristocracy, abolishing torture, and limiting the number of crimes that categorized as capital crimes. Frederick hoped to foster economic growth in Prussia that had been undermined by mid-century wars. Frederick hoped to develop Prussian agriculture by draining swamps and introducing new crops in Prussia. Despite these advancements, many poor Prussians still suffered through taxation and other struggles.
Joseph II of Austria was a cold and rigid man. He ruled by a passionless rationality that he imposed on his kingdom. Despite his cold personality, Joseph wished to improve the general well-being of his people. For all his efforts, he was left with aristocratic and peasant rebellions throughout his empire. Joseph was the son of Maria Theresa, who ruled during the War of Austrian Succession. In order to preserve the monarchy, Theresa gave the nobles significant influence in Hungary. Maria Theresa found innovative ways to strengthen the power of the crown by building the bureaucracy and imposing more efficient tax code. Maria Theresa was concerned with the state of peasants and serfs. She limited the local power of the nobility over peasants and imposed restrictions on the amount of labor demanded of them. Her reason for this was simply to draw more military recruits. Joseph II was much more determined in expanding authority than his mother. His main goal was to expand the authority of the Habsburg Empire over his realms. Joseph was determined to impose authority over places his mother shied away from.
Ecclesiastical policies. Since the early 16th century, the Habsburgs had not been the greatest champions of the Roman Catholic Church. Maria Theresa would not let the Church limit her authority, but she was by no means a supporter of religious tolerance. Joseph's support of the Enlightenment ideals led him to favor religious policy and religious toleration. In 1781, Joseph extended freedom to worship Lutherans, Calvinists, and Greek Orthodox. He allowed him full protection of the law that was extended to Catholics. Joseph dissolved much of the Church's influence in his kingdom. He forbade bishops from communicating with Rome. He stopped more than 600 monasteries, only leaving those that run schools or hospitals. He replaced many of the seminaries that he felt instilled too great loyalty into the papacy rather than the state with state-controlled seminaries. Much like Frederick of Prussia, as mentioned earlier, Joseph wished to foster economic and agricultural growth in Israel. He abolished many tariffs detrimental to the state, encouraged road building, and improved transportation. Joseph reformed the justice system to lessen the influence of the local landlords had seek to reduce the authority of the nobles and to inject into royal oversight. Ultimately, Joseph wished to reduce the burdens on peasants to make them more productive industrious members of society, make it easier to manage inherit land, transfer it over to other peasants. Joseph produced a more daring system of taxation that made all owners of land would be taxed regardless of social status, something Frederick could not accomplish. Joseph's rational policies did cause some internal problems, as peasants and noblemen had disputes over their granted rights. Joseph was received by his brother Leopold II, and even though he was sympathetic to Joseph's idealism, he sought to repeal many of Joseph's controversial policies. Leopold was much more sympathetic to the pleas of noblemen, returning much of the Parliament's influence. He overturned his tax reforms. He said that Joseph was simply too bold for his time. During his reign, he drastically reduced the church's influence, introduced religious tolerism, attempted drastic reform, and for a short time abolished serfdom. Catherine the Great of Russia. After the death of Peter the Great in 1725, Russia struggled to find a ruler who could push the country forward. The throne fell into the hands of 6 different men and women, all with little talent for ruling a kingdom before the landing of Catherine the Great in 1762. Catherine was the wife of Peter III, who was a weak and feckless ruler who many considered to be insane. During Catherine's time in the court of Elizabeth, she became shrewd and quite intelligent woman. Just a few months after his rise as Tsar, Peter III was murdered with the approval of Catherine. Catherine became empress and began work on bringing Russia into a new age. She was convinced Russia was in need of great reform as it would cease to be a great power. Because of Russia's massive Catherine put most authority in the hands of local nobles rather than creating a central bureaucracy. Russian nobles had much greater influence on the rest of Europe. By strengthening the power of the village, she strengthened her own rule. Catherine sought to grow Russia economically. She attempted to export grain, furs, flax, and other products, while also expanding the small Russian middle class. Catherine understood that she could not emancipate the peasants because the influence the nobility had in Russian politics. In 1769, Russia entered in the war with the Ottoman Turks, which was held by the Turks. By 1771, the Russian victors had then gained control over the Ottoman provinces on the Danube River and the Black Sea. Catherine was also able to annex Crimea quite painlessly. Most of the philosophers stated neither Montesquieu, Zarathustra, nor Rousseau's democracy had solutions to contemporary political problems. Voltaire was a strong monarchist who had a personal clash with aristocrats as a young writer with general sense of democratic ideas. In 1759, Voltaire published a history of the Russian Empire under Peter the Great. In the book, Voltaire states Peter was born and Russia was formed. Voltaire was not only the person who believed in a strong monarchy. Diderot was another philosopher who believed in a strong monarchy. Diderot visited Catherine II of Russia, and many of the aristocrats, many of which were ministers to Louis XV and XVI, that did not want to limit the power of monarchs. They instead wanted to use their powers to rationalize economic political structures and free intellectual life. Most philosophies were okay with the power if it came for individual benefits, such as money for themselves, which is important to see is not the enlightenment of political fall, source of non-liberal outlooks. Some European rulers toward the end of the century embraced many reforms that continued. The term enlightened absolute is a form of monarchical government which centers absolute strengthens and rationalizes at the cost of the church, and many other forms rather survived from the Middle Ages. The monarchs associated the Enlightenment with Frederick II Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and Catherine II of Russia. Frederick II corresponded with the philosophy he was giving Voltaire and other places of the court. He even wrote history and music. Catherine II, a skilled at public relations, wanted to create the image of herself being an enlightened ruler. She would privileged cite works of philosophy, subsidized Diderot, and corresponded with Voltaire's teaching. He would go as far as complimenting Voltaire, often in hopes that he would advocate a compliment for her. Joseph continued to work with his mother, Maria Theresa, and he imposed serious legal social reforms carried believe derived from the philosophy's suggestions. The rules being regulating competent, humanitarian, liberating zeal, and only a part of what was to come. The best example would be Voltaire, who wrote against war and would praise the military expansion of Russia because in his mind to bring civilization to what he believed was uncivilized people. The Russians during this time were having military successes that made their neighbors, Prussia and Austria, very uneasy. An extraordinary division of Pole's territory, known as the First Partition of Poland, which helped them overcome their fears. Russia's victories along the Danube River were not well received by Austria, which also harbored ambitions of territorial expansion in that direction. While this was happening, the Ottoman Empire was pressing Prussia. Frederick the Great made a proposal to Russia and Austria that would give each of them something they wanted, preventing conflict among powers and satisfying appearances. After long negotiations, Russia agreed to abandon the Danubian provinces as a reward for agreeing and receiving a large portion of Poland's territory. along with almost 2 million inhabitants. Remaining neutral during this event, Prussia annexed most of the territory between East Prussia and Russia proper. This land would finally give Frederick the ability to unite the two separate sections of this land. Eventually, Austria took southern Poland, which helped create its value due to its salt mines. Also, Austria would go on to take other Polish territory of more than 2.5 million inhabitants. The Polish aristocracy paid for the price of maintaining the internal liberties at the expense of developing a strong central government. Ratifying the seizure was 1/3 of Poland's land. This was a big loss for Poland. However, it was not immediately fatal to Poland's existence, and it inspired a revival of national feeling. Some attempted to help restore Poland. However, the attempts came too late. Poland was not able to compete with the European state system. It demonstrated that the major powers in Eastern Europe were prepared to sell their own rivalry at the expense of such a weak state. In the last 2 decades of the 18th century, the Enlightenment and absolutism regimes became more conservative and politically repressive. Prussian and Austria rulers' innovations caused anger and nobility, while in Russia the fear of peasants revolting became more and more troublesome. Frederick the Great of Prussia grew remote as he was becoming elderly, leaving the aristocracy to fill important military and administrative posts. A reaction to the Enlightenment ideas also set in Prussian Lutheran writers. Austria's Joseph II had plans to restructure society and administer in his land, but it was proved that which grew frustration and political unrest with the nobility, calling for an end of innovation. Joseph afterwards increased censorship and a secret police force. Russia faced the uprising from the peasants they feared, the Pushchev rebellion. Catherine the Great never fully recovered from the fears of social and political upheaval it caused. The French Revolution broke out in 1789, which made Russian leaders grow fearful that this would happen to them in their own country, so they censored books based on Enlightenment thoughts and sent offensive authors to exile in Serbia. At the end of the century, the fear of change permeated the ruling class of Central and Eastern Europe. This reaction would cause events for almost half a century moving forward.